Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. So thank you for joining us today. I am very happy to introduce our returning guest today, John Michael Greer, who is the author of over 80 books. He is also a well-known blogger and astrologer whose work focuses on the overlaps between ecology, spirituality, and the future of industrial society. He served 12 years as the Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America and remains very active in that order, as well as other branches of Druid spirituality. His latest book, The Twilight of Pluto, Astrology and the Rise and Fall of Planetary Influences, is a fascinating look at the waxing and waning impacts of demoted planets, of which Pluto is, of course, the most recent example, and also a beautiful examination of the roles that planetary influences play in the world by examining the discoveries of Uranus and Neptune in the relatively recent past. The book is an exciting and interesting dive into astrological waters and a thought-provoking examination of culture, politics, and history as it unfolds in mythic time. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I'm so happy to welcome him to the podcast today to talk about it today. So thank you for being here to talk about this book.
Well, thank you for having me on again.
So for those who have not yet picked up a copy, I've introduced it a tiny bit, but can you give us a little bit of your background of how you came to feel that this topic was important enough to write a book on? Why this book right now?
Why this book right now? Well, partly it was a matter of personal discovery. Many, many years ago, when I first got into occult studies, I considered taking up astrology, took a good look at the immense complexity of it, and said, this is the kind of thing I want to get into when I turn middle-aged. Well, fast forward a few years, or more than a few years, and about, 15 years ago, I think it was, I looked in the mirror and said, okay, I'm middle-aged. It's time to take a look at astrology again. So I started studying astrology, cast my chart, cast some other people's charts, started doing transits and things like that. And I noticed a curious anomaly very quickly. Pluto in the astrological literature is a big deal. You're supposed to be constantly on the watch for transits that affect your natal Pluto. If you have a conjunction or a hostile aspect by transit with your natal Pluto, it's supposed to cause your life to turn upside down. There's all these horror stories you hear. And it so happened that not long after I really started tracking transits, I noticed, okay, well, I've got these two major planets that are both going to be passing across my natal Pluto. It did nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nothing happened. And I was going, okay, so where are these, where are these things that are supposed to turn my life upside down? This was not long after. Actually, it was just a couple of years after Pluto had been demoted by the International Astronomical Union. I don't know why I do that flip so often, but I do. It'd be great if we had an International Astrological Union that got together in big conferences, in Vienna or something to discuss.
That would be wonderful.
We don't. It'd be something. But so when the IAU in 2006 had downgraded Pluto, I wasn't surprised because I'd been paying a certain amount of attention to the news from planetary science and so on. I was aware that Pluto had turned out to be much, much smaller than anyone had guessed originally, and that it really didn't qualify as a planet. And but of course there was the big hoopla. I knew all about that, and then I started tracking its astrology and going, hold it, something does not fit here. So that was why I started the original process of research. That led me to look into other bodies that had been identified as planets at different times in the not too distant past. The asteroid series, of course, now the dwarf planet series, she was promoted, and the non-existent planet Vulcan, which was treated as a real planet for some time in the very late 19th century, and so on. And so looking at those things, I started saying, okay, there are common patterns here. I interfaced that with my studies in history, and gradually this book project took shape. And so when I finally had everything pretty much together, I got in touch with one of my publishers. They said, oh, cool, write that. And that's how it happened.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating study. And before we leap into, I think, talking about those planets that are not planets now, you begin the book with discussions about how people in more prehistoric times might have viewed the heavens, and how that was very different before the rise of the influence of the planets as major bodies to be studied. And I think that distinction between the times when stars were more prominent versus the planetary times of today is important. Could you tell us a little bit about that difference before 8 or 9,000 BCE?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you look, the best place to start there is Stonehenge. If you've ever been there, it's a marvelous experience. If you haven't, see if you can make the chance. It is a prehistoric observatory. It probably had important ritual functions as well. Modern industrial society is one of the few societies in history that has separated its science from its spirituality. It's a bad move. I hope we can get around to fixing it. But at any rate, so at Stonehenge, when the folks who built Stonehenge were watching the heavens. And if you look at where the stones are placed, and you do as Gerald Hawkins did, half a century ago, and run that through a computer, you figure out very quickly that Stonehenge is designed to track the sun and the moon. Period. No further. No, there are no stones that can be used to track the various points in the planetary cycle as they move away from or toward the ecliptic or what have you. So the planets didn't register in those days. And there's a lot of other lines of evidence that suggest the same thing. The earliest prehistoric records we have of any kind of astronomy going on, or astrology, there are notched sticks and bones that have been found in caves. We're talking back when flint tools were the hot new technology, and they have little notch marks. Where people have obviously been keeping track of something, and it's in groups of 14. So it's pretty clear they were tracking the phases of the moon. And obviously, anybody who is watching the movement of herds of wild animals, or who is watching the cycle by which edible plants ripen and so on, they're going to be tracking the sun. So it makes perfect sense that in very ancient times, people will have paid attention to the sun and the moon. And if you're not really paying a lot of attention to the heavens at night, you may not notice that there are these stars that move. They're not part of the normal process by which stars rotate slowly, through the heavens. They shift position. Doubtless people realized that, for example, the morning star and the evening star, there were these bright lights sometimes, but there are comets, there are meteors, there's stuff up in the sky. The sun and the moon were apparently what counted. And if you look at astrology, if you look at the astrology of the sun, the astrology of the moon, especially in their very ancient forms, that's basically what there was in terms of human culture. They didn't have priesthoods. Those belong to Jupiter. They didn't have organized warfare. That belongs to Mars. They didn't have agriculture. That's Saturn. They didn't even grow gardens. That's Venus. And forget about writing. That hadn't come along yet. That was Mercury. So fast forward from the Paleolithic period to the Neolithic Revolution, when people started, building settled communities, started planting crops deliberately, started doing all these various things, started making the first steps toward writing, priesthoods, unfortunately warfare as well. And it's right around that time that, to the best of our knowledge, people noticed the planets. So just as the discovery of Pluto marked a shift in human consciousness, and of course we'll get to that in a little bit, my theory is, of course, barring a time machine, I don't know how we could prove, my theory is that the discovery of the 5 classical planets back in antiquity happened at the same time as the great revolution in human life that led to cities, agriculture, organized political structures, and the rest of it. That each of those things came in as the planet was discovered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it was interesting that you pointed out that the words for the planets that the Sumerians used were actually from a borrowed, language that was older than them.
We have no idea what language it was. That's one of the amazing things. But yeah, if you look at the original, I'm not even going to try to pronounce them, but if you look at the words that were used in Sumerian for the planets, they're not Sumerian words. They're borrowed from some more ancient people, long since lost to records, but they picked that up. So obviously there was some astronomy, some astrology, some tracking of the heavens going on at a very ancient time.
Yes. And that also ties into the idea that at least for the written records that we have, the most ancient that we still have records, the things that they were tracking were obviously the most large scale events, and it was essentially mundane astrology. It was not. Not we would. Common today.
Yeah. Natal astrology was a late development. The first thing you want to know is, okay, are we going to get through the next year without a war? How's the harvest going to be, etc.? These are the things that mattered at the time. That's what they were trying to track. Of course, when a new prince or princess was born, the astrologer said, let's try checking what was going on at that time against our tables of the planets and so on, and see if we can. So you can see the process of experimentation, whereby natal astrology finally came into being. But it was kind of a Johnny-come-lately in the history of astrology.
But there's also the influence of other bodies like the Pleiades and Sirius as important factors. Although that's separate, that's different from the planetary tracking.
Well, back in the day, again, you're a Sumerian priestess. There you are, sitting on top of this mud brick ziggurat. You're looking out at the incredible brightness and clarity of the heavens as seen in the dust dry sections of the Middle East. But you're high enough. That's why you're on the ziggurat, so you're above the dust. Okay, so there are the heavens. There's all of this stuff going on up there. You might not immediately think, okay, these 5 lights that seem to move, well, does that one? Yeah, kind of. And there's this little thing that shows up right before sunrise or right after sunset that we now call Mercury. Those may not seem quite as important. Look at that bright star there, the bright red one. We're going to end up calling it Antares after a very long time. But yeah, so it took a very long time to sort out which of these things had the strongest influence. And of course, it's not finished yet. There are still people researching the effects of fixed stars, for example. Cometary astrology is a field that was very heavily studied at one point in the late Renaissance. The astrology of supernovas, that was another field that got a lot of attention, and very little has been done with it because we haven't had any big ones recently. But there's a lot of work still to be done.
And staying with ancient history, you point out that the Greeks' main contributions, this is interesting because as fascinated as I am with the Greeks, I don't usually think of the Greeks as being that, influential, shall we say, with astrology, even though I am not an astrologer by any stretch.
Oh, no, the Greeks revolutionized astrology.
Yeah, with geometry, of course. Yeah, no, that makes...
Geometry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the Babylonians, the Sumerians were good at math. The Babylonians were brilliant at math. The reason we have 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute is because that's how the Babylonian system of numbers worked. It was base 60 arithmetic. They worked out, instead of having working out the angles and so on, they had it all done by numbers. And so they had these complicated planetary charts that enabled you to tell numerically where each planet was located. And then, of course, Alexander the Great conquered most of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Greeks moved into the area, and the Greeks took a look at this and went, wow, if you took that as a geometrical symbol, away we go. The Greeks get to work on it, and pretty soon everyone's going, wow, so that's what a horoscope looks like. And so yeah, modern astrology, the astrology as we now know it was a function of the cultural interaction between the Greek talent for geometry and Greek philosophy, also the clarity of Greek logic, and all of this hard, painstaking work on very sophisticated mathematics that had been done by the Babylonians for all those centuries.
No, it's absolutely fascinating. We move forward because I want to kind of put off the question of what precise ways, I don't want to say discovery, because I feel like that's not quite the right word, but the rise in influence of of the tracking of those planets might have, and why that is. Because then you move to speaking about the discovery of Uranus and Neptune, obviously, then before we talk about Pluto, and the ways in which their discoveries, first of all, the method of their discoveries and the timing of it is extremely tied to world events and what eventually became their known influences, shall we say, astrologically, show up in large form. So with Uranus, that discovery was had its biggest effect in England, because you also point out, which I think is an important point, that place also plays a role in this, because we are
place matters.
Place matters. It's not just a thing that happens in a vacuum and therefore affects everyone equally. The place that is centered where that discovery is made has an impact on it. So could you talk a little bit about that with Uranus and how?
Okay. Let's start with Uranus. So we've got William Herschel staring up through his high-tech cutting-edge telescope in 1781. Okay, there he is, and he spots what can't be there. It looks like a star, but it has a visible disk. It must be, well, is it a comet? Holy crap, it's a planet. There's actually more planets. This was unbelievably revolutionary at the time. Remember, since ancient times, of thousands of years, there were just the 5 planets and the 2 luminaries, and now there is another planet. And so he announces it. Everyone gradually figures out, yes, it's a planet. It almost gets named Herschel after him. Thank heavens it did not. So we have Uranus, and Uranus turns out to be the planet of revolution. It's the planet of eccentricity. It's the planet of doing your own thing and going your own way. It's the planet of sexual minorities. It's a planet of every kind of, I'm going to do something different. And so it's discovered right as the American Revolution is reaching its most critical phase, right before the victories that led to American independence, that unleashed the concept of democracy on the world as something other than just this weird little idea that some strange people have. It comes a little before the French Revolution. It comes right at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. It's a revolutionary planet. And of course, as astrologers started tracking it, checking it in natal charts, saying, okay, now this new planet is here, and look what's trining it. I wonder how that's going to play out, and so on. Yeah, they figured out very quickly, yes, this is a revolutionary planet. This is a planet that blows things up and turns them over and scatters the pieces into new shapes. And that was exactly the force that was hitting the world right around the time it was discovered. Now, one thing that shows up very clearly with Uranus, and we'll see it as we go, is that the influence of a newly discovered planet starts to really come in about one Saturn cycle, about 30 years before the planet's discovery. And it's not surprising that it should be so, because Saturn is the lord of time. So you have this Saturn cycle effect, this 30-year sort of phase-in period. And again, we saw that with Uranus. And say 1751, you start having the first really significant stirrings of the concept of democracy. You have the first stirrings of the Industrial Revolution really starting to get going. These funny, clunky devices that were being used to pump water out of coal mines. Some people started saying, if I made that a little more efficient, we could use it for other purposes. And from there, we get the steam engine and the beating heart of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution. And there's lots of things that follow, and it's after Uranus shows up that science fiction is invented. Science fiction is the literature of revolution. It's the literature of Uranus. And I could go on with plenty of other examples, but I think you get the picture. That the planet shows up right in the middle of the burst in which a new influence enters human consciousness. England was where it was discovered. England was ground zero for the Industrial Revolution. It was affected very strong. Obviously, the American Revolution, the French Revolution did not happen there, but they affected Britain profoundly, catapulting it into its new role as the industrial power, as a place where religious liberty had become sacrosanct, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that also ties into, because what we are talking about is very, very firmly a Western and predominantly like a European and
Mm-hmm.
American sort of form of these things, which has
Mm-hmm.
been, I mean, just through colonialization and empire being what it has been the dominant, culture of
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people on this planet right now. And certainly the ones
Mm-hmm.
that we, you and I speaking English are the most
Mm-hmm.
capable of talking about right now. But that also doesn't mean that these things affect everyone on the planet equally in some
No.
sense, because their cultures are possibly working through other astrological lenses or having other,
Mm-hmm.
cultural ideas of the
Mm-hmm.
heavens that aren't
There,
necessarily what we're talking about right now.
yeah. That's very important to keep in mind. There are, broadly speaking, there are four great traditions of astrology in the world. There is Chinese astrology. There is Indian astrology. There is the Western astrology as we practice it, which is practiced through the Muslim world and then in Europe and throughout the European diaspora. And then you have Mesoamerican astrology, the astrology of the Mayans and so on, which of course was largely destroyed by the conquistadors, but is being revived right now. It's an extremely rich system now that the Mayan hieroglyphs can be read. There are people who are working on bringing that back into use.
Yeah.
But each of those understands the heavens in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's appropriate that it should be so, because different peoples, different nations, different cultures are going to react to the heavenly influences in different ways. So yeah, what we're talking about is European astrology, is Western astrology, and doubtless the world looks very different when you look at it from the point of view of, say, Jyotish, Hindu astrology.
Mm-hmm. That actually ties into some questions that I have for later. So I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to go there quite yet, but
dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, exactly. So then moving forward, of course, then you talk a little bit about Neptune. And then after that, you bring up obviously the title of the book, which is the influence of Pluto. But along the way, as you mentioned before, there's also planets that are no longer considered planets anymore, which was proved not to exist at all. Ceres, Lilith, which for some people, I think, still is considered relevant, although it's very, very minority.
Lilith is, as you'd expect, is a very evasive, the thing. One of the things that makes these maybe planets or what have you so interesting is that each one of them is so different. I mean, Ceres was discovered in right at the beginning of the 19th century, and there's been no question that here is this object. We know where it is. We know what it looks like. It's quite a solid, very earthy sort of thing, and so it has these connections with nourishment, with nurturing. When it's badly aspected in natal chart and strongly placed, you can see its influence. It's very, very steadying kind of thing. You have Pluto, which we'll get to. You have Vulcan, the imaginary planet, which people saw, by the way. Charles Fort, who was was basically blazing the trail in recent research in paranormal things and anomalies, used to say that science gets its reputation by trumpeting all its successes and erasing as many of its failures as it can get away with. Vulcan is a great example. It was quote discovered unquote by calculations based on the orbit of Mercury. There was good reason to think there was a planet here. People claimed to have seen it. Quite a few people claimed to have seen it. And yet it turned out that the wobbles in the orbit of Mercury were actually being caused by relativistic factors. And more people couldn't see it than claimed to see it. And everyone pretty much is clear that it doesn't exist, that it never existed in the first place. And yet for some years there, it was treated as a reality. So it's an odd little thing. Lilith, there have been at least two different, actually there's now like four different things that were maybe other moons of the Earth, or maybe they're not. It's all wrapped up in a kind of cloud of confusion and evasion. And yeah, there are still people who are completely convinced that whether they treat Lilith as a moon, whether they treat Lilith as the other focus of the moon's orbit, or what have you. So it's exceedingly difficult to pin down.
Mm-hmm. Just because I happen to call myself a witch, I was very fascinated with that tiny section that you had in the book, because I really hadn't thought about the connection between the history of, Wicca and witchcraft and, feminism and things like that. Because it related to the rise and fall of like Lilith as an idea. And I think it's fascinating that the idea of the witch, which is always kind of like on the outskirts of society and hidden in some way, is also this planet that may or may not exist, but is very
also the dark moon. Well, the thing is, as I suggest in the book, it makes perfect sense in the context of the time. In Victorian society, the image of the feminine, of woman, was split down the middle. And you have the angel in the house, if you can, read Coventry Patmore without projectile vomiting. All of this extremely florid, extremely fake, woman, pure and sweet. And then you have the whore. And you have this radical division within the feminine energies within Western culture. And that expressed itself very clearly by the emergence of this ghost moon, which was the other, which was the whore, the harlot, the witch, the strangling and devouring feminine that so many Victorian men desperately wish they could meet. But it made perfect sense that as the Victorian era crashed into ruin, spiritually as well as practically, as Pluto did the job, one of the jobs he was there to do, and did it exceedingly well, and the whole hoopla, the whole nonsense around sexuality in the Victorian era came crashing down, that the ghost moon kind of faded off into the distance, and the moon, the one we actually have, resumed both of her aspects as a mediator of the feminine energies.
Yeah.
So and became the classic emblem of the witch in the sort of post-Gerald Gardner period. Where before then it had been much more complicated, and the way that the image of the witch had been batted back and forth there's a long, intricate story there. Ronald Hutton has told quite a bit of it in his book Triumph of the Moon, but there's more. I don't think, like most English researchers, he tends to neglect the American end of things, and there were some very influential American feminists, early feminists, 19th century feminists, who were very into the idea of witches.
That's very true. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Triumph of the Moon, but I know what you mean about would be lovely to have something of that sort for the American side, or have it integrated into it. But
a good history of American witchcraft would be amazing to read.
Yes. Before we get sidetracked, I just want to.
That's easy to do. Well, anytime you bring Lilith in, sidetracks are going to happen. She's that kind of energy.
So, extremely appropriate. So going back to kind of like world history and how this comes into play, there was the influence of Neptune. We don't need to go into that in too much detail. You talk about that beautifully in the book,
which is huge, and will be even more potent now that Pluto has sunsetted out of his planetary period. Neptune is the outer edge of the planets. Neptune is the Lord of the Great Deep. We are going to see a lot more from him in the centuries ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, that you use that terminology, and that brings up a question, because you point out in the book that Uranus and Neptune were named by people who were not necessarily aware of what the influence, obviously, of those planets they were naming would be. And to a degree, they're not really appropriate for their influences. But in some ways, like as you said, Neptune, perhaps there's some aspect of that where the name may be appropriate. But could you just talk a little bit about the naming and whether you think it's appropriate or not?
Yeah, one of the things, one of the problems with the naming of Uranus and Neptune is that it was done by a handful of scholars writing letters back and forth. They were all up to their eyeballs in classical mythology, and they weren't astrologers, and they weren't Astrology was kind of in eclipse in those days, and so Uranus got his name purely because, Saturn is the father of Jupiter in Greek mythology. Well, who's the father of Saturn? If we go further, we get Uranus. That planet probably should have been named Prometheus, because it has that Promethean energy. As far as Neptune, many of the astrologers that I've read and talked to have, their feeling is that actually Neptune is a feminine energy, not a masculine energy. It should have been named after a goddess, not a god. And there are a variety of possible goddesses that one could choose. But yeah, it does have this very oceanic quality. It does have this the place where everything blends together. It is the planet of unity, where Uranus is the planet of individuality, which is why you get, with the arrival of Neptune, you get ideas of social unity, you get the rise of socialism, you get the rise of the idea of the welfare state. Generally, the idea of public welfare as being a concern for anybody but the people affected. And a whole range of other things. But it's also the planet of dreams and of myths and of fantasy fiction and a range of other factors like that. I use the phrase Lord of the Great Deep partly because it refers back to, Neptune, the sea god, but also the great deep in a certain sense is outer space. That's the truly great deep. And Neptune is the planet that defines the outer edge of the planetary field in the solar system. Mm. And so he is, he or she, however you want to call that planet, is the ruler of that influence, the planetary force that takes the infinite and mirrors it down to us, against which Uranus defines himself as standing apart from that. There's a lot of numerology in there, and I expect to see some very interesting changes over I won't see them personally. I don't expect to live for the next couple of thousand years, but I'm sure there will be some really interesting changes in symbolism and numerology and so on as those planetary forces get integrated.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to tie that back in with the naming, I think it is very appropriate and interesting that the next planet that we'll talk about, Pluto, of course, was named by a little girl, I believe.
They held a contest.
Like from the mouths of babes, in some sense that naming is very appropriate and interestingly came from that source.
One of the things that a lot of people in ancient times there were oracles where you would go into a temple and you would pray, and then you would plug your ears and walk straight out into the marketplace and open your ears, and the first thing someone said at random was the answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So there's this idea that that the people, the sort of unthinking voice of everyday life can actually tell you a lot. And so the fact that they ran a contest, and the 9-year-old girl came up with the idea, why don't we call it Pluto? Because it lives out there in the dark. It's kind of like the underworld. And the guys at the observatory that discovered it thought it was a good move because the first letters of Pluto, PL, were also the initials of the guy who funded the observatory. So he was happy. The initials of Pluto add up to the initials of Percival Lowell. So everyone liked it. That was how but Pluto turned out to be very well named. Because the planet Pluto, as he was for a while, turned out to have that very plutonic, that very underworld-related, in every sense of the word, the very subversive quality. The interesting thing is that Ceres, the now dwarf planet, of course, also has a very good name because she does turn out to have, Ceres is the goddess of agriculture. Okay, Ceres has that vibe. Has that relationship with nourishment, with nurturing, with abandonment, when not, and the connection, because Ceres is Demeter, so you have the Demeter-Persephone angle there, and so on. And she actually has those influences in natal charts.
Mm-hmm.
So very clearly we're dealing with, a situation where it's a gamble as to whether a planet will get the right name or not. So Ceres and Pluto have lived up to their names, and I hope to keep them. But some future civilization will doubtless decide, we're not going to call that Uranus anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can be changed or morph in some other way in the future. So as we're talking about Pluto, so with its discovery, it was discovered right around the turn of the century. Was it 1900 or 1901?
Well, it was actually discovered in 1930.
Oh, 1930, that's right. The search
1930,
began.
There's that 30-year phase-in period. Right around 1900 was when you had all kinds of Plutonian influences start bursting into being in society. You have Sigmund Freud popping up with psychoanalysis and saying, this thing, the individual is not a unity. There's the conscious and the subconscious minds, and they don't necessarily go in the same direction. And if you the interaction between them is a source of energy. You have Albert Einstein going, E equals mc squared. The atom is not a unity, and if you split it, it's going to release an enormous amount of energy. You have the transformation that turned Marxism, which was a very Neptunian thing, very utopian and so on. Suddenly that gets into the hands of a guy named Lenin. It becomes a revolutionary subversive ideology. He's going, oh, no, we're not going to sit and wait for dialectical materialism to bring about the perfect society. We're going to organize and be subversive and co-opt groups and seize power, and then we're going to kill lots of people, and so on and so on. You have just splitting the world in half, as happened during the Cold War. You have all of these splits, all of these divisions of unity, and Pluto doing, what Pluto did in the myth. He's grabbing Persephone and dragging her off to the underworld. He's dividing the gods against themselves, and he's dividing the world. And so, yeah, you have that influence landing starting in about 1900, but building to crescendo right around 1930.
And there's also the idea of the sort of rejection of ordered beauty and harmony. At that point, I mean, you talk about it from, obviously, for myself as a professional musician, I found, the discussion of how each of these influences, in the arts, very fascinating, but particularly like modernist movements that are very Plutonian in that sort of rejection of the word that you used to describe it as cosmos, which I think is a really important concept for people.
The concept, the word cosmos comes to us from Greek, and cosmos actually comes from the same root as cosmetic. It's the thing that makes beautiful. Cosmetic is something that makes you beautiful. Cosmos is ordered beauty. And so the idea of the Greek vision was that the cosmos, the universe, is structured according to a beautiful order. And that's one of the reasons that their own culture created so much ordered beauty of the same kind. But yeah, when you get Pluto coming in, you get modernism in art, you get modernism in music, you get composers going, what do you mean? We can't have anything that sounds good. We can't have anything that communicates to the listener. That's bad. That's old-fashioned. Get rid of tonality. We're going to go to these various gimmick systems that look really interesting on paper, but produce completely unlistenable music. And so you have this whole modernist movement, which thank heavens is finally breaking down now that Pluto is out of the way. And of course, you had that just across the board. The arts defined themselves as, good quality art. Nobody should like it. I exaggerate very slightly, but only very slightly.
Yes. Yeah. There is my husband is a composer, and he writes actually out, he's been doing it for quite a while, but he has worked doing compositions for TV and film and things of that nature, where that modernist trend did not fully actually, because if you're being paid for something, there are aspects of the arts where that did not take hold, but in the the art scene per se, that's what it's held on.
Oh, exactly. And one of the consequences, in fact, was that everybody, as things drew on, everyone who had serious talent stayed away from the art scene. And they went into things like composing music for the media, where you get some really attractive, meaningful, effective compositions. Or they were, a lot of people with visual arts. So these days, they make video games. They don't waste their time doing stuff for galleries.
It's just changed form. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you take your talent and you take it to someplace. The thing is, the arts get into this kind of thing now and again. You have this tendency for the arts to fossilize into a rigid academicism, and it always produces ugly art. If you've looked at a French academic painting from the 19th century, you have with Bouguereau as a great example. You have all of these loathsome cotton candy, puffy cherubs and scantily clad women with vapid faces gazing at nothing in particular and so on, all in this sort of pseudo-Greek, technically brilliant, emotionally vomitous. It now sits in warehouses mostly, or in the corners in third-rate art museums, because nobody can stand the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, opera went through that in what would have been most of the way through the 18th century. You had the opera seria, serious opera. Nobody plays it anymore. It's unlistenable. It's dull.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, by the mid 21st century, people are going to look at the popular composers, or they're not popular, but the officially accepted academic composers of our time, and they're going to go, why? And they're going to look at the modern paintings. We could leave out Andy Warhol because he was a comedian, a brilliant one, not a painter. But they're going to look at the Roy Lichtensteins and the Jasper Johns and so on, and say, stick those in the warehouse. Nobody's ever going to want to see them again.
Yes.
And they'll be right.
And I think you point out very nicely in the book, though, that it's not about positing like one age as good or bad. So you're not making the case that like everything from the age of Pluto is terrible. And of that nature, there were actually many things about it that are just like in each of those ages previously. There were many beautiful contributions. And of course, then there were also bloody and terrible contributions as well, particularly with the age of Pluto with the Second World War. But that doesn't mean that there are not beautiful, good things about each of those things.
No, the thing is, Pluto was absolutely necessary in his time. I mentioned in the book, and I'd probably give it an even larger billing now if I were rewriting it. The most popular laxative in America in 1930, when that planet was discovered, was called Pluto water, and its slogan was, "When nature won't, Pluto will." And so, we had Pluto came along to clear away there's no better word for it, the spiritual constipation of the Victorian era. Sigmund Freud. These days, his stuff is useless because he's done his job. Nobody pretends anymore that they don't have sexual desires. Mm-hmm. Everyone insisted on that. The idea in Victorian in the Victorian world, in the English-speaking countries, was that women had no sexual desire at all. And if you even let yourself notice that you had such a desire, that proved you were a depraved creature doomed to a life of shame and a loathsome death. It was a nightmare. Mm-hmm. And so Pluto came along and goosed Sigmund Freud, and he said, well, actually, give me a break. Let's talk about the origin of all these neuroses and these hysterical paralyses and so on, and so on and so on. There were a lot of things that desperately needed to be cleared away, and Pluto cleared them away. Mm-hmm. That he has finished his time as a planet doesn't mean he wasn't desperately necessary at the time. It means he's done his work. Mm-hmm. And we had, the collapse of the European empires. We had the sweeping away of a lot of cant and nonsense that defended those empires and defended the sort of cultural imperatives that made them plausible. And that's gone now. Mm-hmm. And so Pluto is kind of dawdling off to the far edge of the solar system, wiping his hands on his apron, going, okay, I've done my job.
And it also has each of those planets and those interplays of forces have an effect on the occult scene and on spiritual matter, especially
very much
on
so.
astrology.
As much as on everything else,
yeah. And for Pluto, that was there has been that rise, or there was that rise, which now has been fading, as you pointed out, of the birth chart as very, very important, as the idea of individual analysis, and kind of looking at astrology also from a psychological perspective, and helping people to understand aspects of themselves and stuff like that, which is I think there's been obviously too much emphasis on that, but it's very necessary and it's very
useful. It was necessary. Yeah, exactly. I think basically probably sometime around 2100 the astrologers will finish sorting it all out, and there will be a new branch of astrology, which will be called perhaps psychological astrology, which will go along with mundane astrology and horary astrology and so on. And if you want to learn about yourself, you go to a psychological astrologer who will sit you down and look at your natal chart and help you unpack your psyche. It'll be a specialty. It will draw very heavily on the work of astrologers from the Plutonian era. It'll be very useful. It's just there's more that you can do with a natal chart. Mm-hmm. Even just a natal chart. I mean, you can actually use it for prediction or concept. And but the rejection of cosmos, the rejection of an ordered universe, the rejection of the idea that there were any restraints at all, that there were any limits at all, yeah, this is very Plutonian. And so you had that rigidly personality-centered astrology, which would not make predictions because you can do anything, you can be anything. Well, no, you can't. You can do and be a lot of things, probably more than you think. But, you know, you can flap your arms all you want and you will not rise into the air.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And so that post-Plutonian astrological change has been more of the resurgence of interest in mundane astrology, in other aspects of astrology.
Very much so. Very much so. We're seeing a lot more interest in mundane astrology, a lot more interest in electional astrology in the occult community, especially among practical mages. Electional astrology is really picking up. People are thinking, oh, cool, you mean I can choose the right time to do this working and have not only my own energies, but the momentum of the universe pushing me along. I like this idea. So there's a lot of work on electional astrology, drawing from medieval and Renaissance sources. There's more work with horary astrology. I'm starting to see some interest again in medical astrology, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of, astrology is a vast field. There are many different branches of it, and I hope we see more of them get picked up and worked with as the Plutonian age finishes winding down. If it follows the usual pattern, the pattern that we saw with Ceres, the pattern that we saw with Vulcan, it should finish winding down about 30 years. There's that Saturn cycle again, about 30 years after its official demotion. So we had the demotion in 2006, so about 2036. So what would be 14 years from now? It should have basically finished going away by that time. And of course, I went out on a limb. I made some predictions in my book about what would happen by then. And some of those predictions, I think, we seem to be moving in the right direction. Some of them we'll see. But yeah.
And I think with that changeover, because you noted also from a cultural perspective of like the idea of going to the stars and science fiction and all of that stuff being a very Plutonian sort of obsession that is kind of going away, but it's sort of the reintroduction of limits is not necessarily a bad thing. And coming back to divination, like if you only ever get good readings, you're probably doing something wrong, A, and B, you're probably not getting very useful information from that. So exactly. It's kind of the idea of limits give you what you need in order to move forward, actually.
Yeah. If you're casting a series of readings to try to figure out, well, which of these things should I do, and the readings only talk about the good side, you're not getting a lot of useful information. Mm-hmm. And if all your readings are going, yeah, everything's fine, and it's not, you're going to get clobbered. With regard to space travel and science fiction, that's actually a point I want to build on here a little bit, because a lot of people misunderstand. These days, when you say science fiction, everyone thinks space travel. If you go back before Pluto, before the discovery of Pluto, before 1930, space travel was just one minor element in science fiction. The first novel of science fiction ever written, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, didn't have a rocket in it. Jules Verne, he wrote, 60 or 70 novels that could more or less count as science fiction, some very much so. 2 of them had to do with space travel. H.G. Wells, another big science fiction writer, 2 of his had to do with space travel. Most of them had nothing to do with, climbing into giant metal phalluses and going off into the void. And the fact that, we've got this obsession with the idea of space, of heading out there in a vacuum, in an emptiness, cutting ourselves off from the living world, and it's very Plutonian. And for reasons that I talk about in that book and also in some of my other writings, it's also not going to happen. There are very good reasons to think that the whole science fiction future was a pipe dream to start with. Now, we didn't know that at the time, but now that scientists have determined that interplanetary space is full of hard radiation, and the planets have turned out to be much less hospitable than anybody thought back in the day. We're not going to the stars. That doesn't mean that history ends. That doesn't mean that, it certainly doesn't mean that we're just going to be going around and around in the same circles we're in now. The world doesn't work that way. Humanity will doubtless have a very long history on this planet, still, ahead of us, but it'll be different. Mm-hmm. It'll be different. It won't be what people are expecting. And it would be nice. One of the things I hope to see is more science fiction, because I'm a longtime science fiction reader. I would like to see more science fiction ditch the giant steel phalluses and ditch the obsession with the void and the dreary, endless rehash of we're going to the stars. I mean, that was already dull in the 1930s. Come on, but ditch that and actually give us some interesting futures for a change.
Yeah. And it has to do with sort of like the widening and sometimes the difficulty with imagination. Because from a permaculture perspective, I remember having a conversation with another friend of mine who was a teacher of mine for design theory. And he was saying how in trying to envision, what we want the world to be, if we're designing something, we're sort of co-creating with land, it's very difficult for us as modern people to envision what the world could look like because we're so limited, we're so straitjacketed by what we've experienced. So it's kind of a failure of the imagination. So like it's the same thing of like people have the science fiction in their head if that's what science fiction is. It's like, no, there's much broader possibilities, but that's sometimes very difficult to get to because we're so used to those.
We've pretended there are no limits, and the result is that our imaginations have become incredibly limited. Talk about return of the repressed. What you're not looking at sneaks up behind you and clobbers you over the head. And so, we've got these incredibly straitjacketed, narrow, rigid views about the future while we're convinced that there's no limits and there are no, we can be whatever we want to be as long as it's this one narrow little thing.
Or, as you point out, or it's just all going to immediately implode and nothing is.
And exactly. Yeah. Well, basically, it's the two Plutonian possibilities. Either, we're going to blow up the world, we'll all die, very Plutonian, or it's, we're going to jump onto the giant metal phallus and go zooming off into dead, hard vacuum, laced with lethal radiation, to land on some barren lump of rock that looks more than anything else like, some of the more boring parts of Nevada. How exciting. Maybe there are other choices. Maybe there are.
But some of the things that we're talking about right now in terms of like the ways that imagination has been sort of straitjacketed or something like that, things like that, they are from longer in the past than just 1900. These tendrils of thought have been unfortunately growing for a very long time. So it's kind of difficult to tease. I suppose what it is that Pluto has its own influences that it sort of strengthened some of that, would you say? Yeah. And brought it into a more violent form, maybe, or?
I think that's part of it, but also it's a matter of monoculture. Yes, these seeds were out there, but so were many, many other things. But then you have the Plutonian influence, and only the Plutonian seeds are cultivated. The rest are whacked to the ground with a weed whacker. And so we get this sort of Plutonian, this temporary Plutonian monoculture. And because, Pluto, I don't think, none of the planets, I think, create these things new, but they support this and they retard that. They fertilize this and they dump weed killer on that. And so they have that kind of influence on the many seeds that are already there.
So that kind of ties into a question which we've sort of skirted around before, but what is the agency then behind this? Because I'm a polytheist. I think you are as well. And
Mhm.
What kind of agency, or where are we placing agency in this? I think it's probably a very complex thing, or maybe even it's like a chicken
Mhm.
or the egg. We can't say anyway. But you do. I think it's important to point out that in the book, you are very strongly stressing that this is not just like a mechanistic. It's not a
No,
mechanistic thing, and it's also
it's not
not
a.
just one person with a telescope saying, "Oh, I found this, and now the world will change because of me all by myself."
Exactly. The crucial point, I've had to address this every time I've talked in public about the Pluto book. People think, hold it, you're saying that a bunch of scientists can make a decision and that changes the heavens? And I'm going, no. I'm saying that the heavens determine what decisions scientists make.
Mhm.
You know, the actions of the International Astronomical Union are not somehow insulated from celestial influences. Individuals acting on their own can work with their planetary influences. You know, it's the old saying, the wise rule their stars, fools are ruled by their stars. So you can learn to surf the various planetary influences. You can excuse me. You can say, okay, let's see, there's a negative aspect to my natal Mars. I'm going to be staying home this Friday night. Or you can say, my natal Mars is being strengthened, and in a good way, I can push here, or what have you. But when you start getting into collective groups, when you start getting into like the International Astronomical Union, much less nations and things like that, you're out of the range that individuals can really influence. You're into the things that the astrologers back in the day said, this is the work of the heavens. These tides happen willy-nilly. As far as human beings are concerned, we don't control them. We have agency in how we respond to them, but we can't make them happen and we can't make them stop. In a sort of polytheistic version as well, of course, the classic way of thinking of that is that each of the planets, including the one we're on, of course, is the body of a being. Is the body of we could say a god or a goddess, certainly a great intelligence, a being that is vastly older than any of us and has certain influences, certain relationships, certain powers in the world. And that these form a sort of vast community orbiting the sun, which is also, again, such a being. And then further out, you have, the stars, and you have this whole, a universe full of life and intelligence. How you want to work it out in terms of any given polytheology or what have you, is of course, depends on your particular beliefs. But that was how the old Neoplatonists said. Of course, in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, even with Christianity as kind of a veneer over the top, the idea was, okay, we're going to call the planetary gods angels. Yeah, same thing.
And
so yeah. And so you get C.S. Lewis's Planetary trilogy, which is written. It's one of the best evocations of the sort of medieval view of the planets that you'll ever find. And of course, he's very careful to have his Eldils and his planetary intelligences are all very Christian. But the layer of Christianity is about 1/8 of an inch thick, and you can scrape it off with a fingernail.
I will have to read that. I have not.
You haven't. Yeah, out of the silent planet, Paraland has that hideous strength. Fun stuff.
Fantastic. I think that also that speaks to one of the things I think when I was younger and I was first looking into astrology, I was interested in it. It's very interesting, but I think at the time that I was reading about it, or the book that I happened to have picked up, it seemed very limited to just psychological trait analysis in a sense, which is, it's fascinating and it's valuable, but I think that it lacked kind of the depth that you can get with it when you are looking at it from, say, a broader perspective of them as larger forces, which are not just something that can get turned in pop culture into, well, I'm an Aries, so that's why I have a temper, or, just something that you use to sort of explain the way you behave.
Yes, I have a Leo moon, and that's why I'm so obnoxious. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, it really is sad the way that it was watered down like that, because again, astrology can provide you with guidance. It can provide you with predictions. You can say, this is what's going on for the next year. Here are the energies you're going to have to deal with, and they're not in yourself. They are in the universe. They are part of that beautiful order of the cosmos. Deal.
Yeah, which also saves us from becoming just like super narcissistic with it and ignoring the rest of the world. So,
and the thing is, that is kind of when Pluto gets unbalanced, when Pluto really runs full tilt, you tend to get this sort of malignant narcissism. Not just the sun. And a badly dignified sun will give you the classic narcissist. You know, I am the center of your universe, and those of us who have a lot of planets in Leo, we get used to having to try to balance that habit out. But the Plutonian version is toxic. It's, you know, I am the center of my universe, and you are something I can manipulate and abuse. Mm. Yeah. And so it's just as well that that's going away, because, yeah, unfortunately, the way that astrology got turned into the standard excuse for a pickup line in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. You go to a meat market and bar, and the first thing somebody says to you says, "So what's your sign?"
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then we kind of turn to what you have towards the later half of the book, which is your sort of idea of how the new numbering of the planets, you know, letting Pluto mm-hmm. kind of join the dwarf planets, not saying that there's mm-hmm. no influence, you know, that there is influence depending on the chart and depending on the time and what,
exactly. So Pluto becomes like Ceres, like Chiron, Eris nowadays. I mean, there are astrologers working right now trying to figure out her influence now that she's been discovered. It'll take a little while, but you know, give it a few decades, and we'll have a very clear idea of what that dwarf planet is doing, and so on. Yeah, I mean, these things have an influence. It's just not on scale. Well, one of the things I want to insert here, in case any of our listeners still think, well, maybe Pluto really is a planet, I want to stress how small Pluto is. Pluto is 1/7 the size of Earth's moon. It's tiny. It's 1/400th the size of Earth. It's a little snowball of a world. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the reason the astronomers made the decision they did. They had gone through this process of figuring out how big it was, and each time we got better telescopes, we got a telescope in orbit, or we got better numbers off the movements of Uranus and Neptune, or finally, of course, we threw a satellite, actually a space probe, around Pluto, and then we could say, okay, this is a little dirty snowball. Mm-hmm. You know, it's ice and a little bit of methane, and that's about it. It's not a planet.
Yet people are very emotionally attached to it, as you point out in the book, which is kind of also that attachment to. I mean, we could try to psychoanalyze, analyze it. There is some attachment that people feel to mm-hmm. the ways that we were told the world was. So,
well, the thing is, also Pluto is the planet of addiction. Mm. And people get addicted to Pluto. Astrologers get addicted to Pluto because Pluto is so very useful. Pluto is an explanation. And so, yeah, Pluto, it seems completely unsurprising to me that Pluto should in fact be a habit difficult to break.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is its own way of thinking. That habit is hard to break, and therefore mm-hmm. take the Saturn amount of time in order for its influence to continue waning. But
to finally fade out, and to the point that people will look back on modern art and modernist music and respond to it the same way they respond now to the real excesses of romantic art and music from the early 19th century, in the era of Ceres, when Ceres was considered to be a planet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope to live to see, mm-hmm. just to see that whole thing brushed away, because I was never very fond of it. Pluto is not well placed in my chart.
So towards the end of the book, you also speak about how you would envision the 7 remaining, planetary mm-hmm. forces as taking their place on the tree of life, because mm-hmm. there are so many, from older astrological and conceptions, there was the seven bodies, but that includes the sun and the moon as part of them. I mean, I work with planetary hours quite a bit in my magic and other systems that use that. And you posit that we could change that. And could you just talk a little bit about that?
Eventually. I mean, the thing is, the integration of a new planetary influence is not a fast process. So, we've got planetary hours and things like that. Everyone's used to that sevenfold cycle. And I've thought of at least two ways that it could end up playing out down the road. On the one hand, we could end up with a cycle of 9 rather than a cycle of 7, where you have the sun, the moon, and the 7 planets. On the other hand, it is entirely possible that the sun will be quiet, over the centuries to come. Some bright soul will drop the sun and the moon out of their place in the cycle and put Uranus in place of the sun and Neptune in place of the moon. They have kind of the same vibes in some ways. And so in that case, it would be, you have the 7 planets, you have the 2 luminaries, and you have the Earth. Give us 10. One of the major problems with the Tree of Life and with the vast amount of magical and spiritual and mystical material based on it is that the Tree of Life as we have it is still based on Ptolemaic astrology. The idea is, you've got the Earth, you've got the moon, you go up, up, up. Saturn is the 3rd sphere Binah. There's Chokmah over here, which we're going to make the sphere of the fixed stars, and then above that's the primum mobile. All of this is the world as it was believed to exist before Copernicus. Now, I don't know. I'm sure there must be people out there who, out there in the Western world who believe that there is a fixed sphere of stars surrounding, outside of the order of Saturn. It's just, a sphere with little holes in it through which light shines. And then there's one more sphere on the outside of that where God dwells or something. Every other belief, from the flat Earth to, I don't know what, has remained popular in some little corner of Western society, so I'm sure that one. But most of us are well aware there is no sphere of the fixed stars. The stars are scattered across nearly infinite space. And that there is no primum mobile out from there. The center of the solar system is actually the sun. And that's the primum mobile. That's what everything moves around. That's the gravity that controls the whole. So we're left with this mismatch between a 15th century cosmological diagram and the fact that a huge amount of Western magic is based on the Tree of Life. One of the advantages to clearing away some of this and accepting Uranus and Neptune, but recognize that Pluto is not actually a planet, is that it all works out. You simply say, well, this is the Tree of Life as seen from the Earth. Doubtless, if we ever do settle Mars, which I don't expect, but if that ever does happen, they'll have to work out something else there. But this, from the perspective of Earth, here we go. And in that case, Binah is Saturn, Chokmah is Uranus, and Keter, the first sphere, the sphere of absolute unity, is Neptune. And once you start looking at that, meditating on it, using it in practice, it actually works very well. And it allows us to integrate our knowledge of the actual cosmos with our magical symbolism. And I think that's probably the way things will go over the next half century or so. And magicians are conservatives. Magicians typically keep doing things that were done 15,000 years ago or what have you, just because it works. But things do gradually change, and so I think that's one alteration that I hope we can look forward to.
No, it makes a great deal of sense how you explain it in the book, and I'll definitely be looking forward to kind of meditating with that and seeing where that idea goes. Outside of that, I wanted to kind of just talk as we kind of move towards the end, with all the sort of negatives, shall we say, because there are some very significant ones, from the influence of Pluto in that 100-year period. You point out towards the end of the book that it was in a sense not a mistake. It was a gift, really. And that at this time there happened to be, and I've thought about this a great deal about, all the upheaval that's going on in the world and so many other things that are happening. There are so many people incarnated right now in our world, and that
more than ever before, as far as we know, probably more than ever will be again. because we're busy using up the resources that enable that large of a population to be sustained. So yeah, we're probably within a very short distance of the all-time peak of human population on the planet, which is a very strange thing to think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yet, so then through the act of having gone through that somewhat initiatory experience of this difficulty that Pluto has brought us through, although, with a lot of necessary clearing work that is done through that, then there is a form of, a sort of separation that then can lead back into integration at the end of it. In what way do you think people who are not astrologers can think with that? Because I feel like that's a really important concept, whether you practice astrology on a daily basis or not.
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to be aware that initiation can traditionally be a very harrowing kind of experience. It is not, people don't run up and pat you on the head and tell you how nice you are in an initiatory ritual, whether it's a tribal initiation or a magical initiation or a lodge initiation, what have you. You generally get the bejesus scared out of you at least once. And it's deliberately made kind of rough. And to some extent that's hazing, but that's not what it has to be. The point is that an initiatory experience has to shake you out of your existing habits. And when you're talking about an entire species, that takes some shaking. And so I think a lot of what's been going on during this interval of time, this period of peak human population, is precisely that we have been being shaken hard to wake us up. And so whatever else unfolds from this, if you can look at what's happening, first of all, of course, if you have the awareness that this one life isn't all there is, that there are, whatever your beliefs about the world, whether, as I do, you believe in reincarnation or what have you, if you realize that this one life is, important as it is, it's not the be all and end all, you don't stop when you die, then it's a little easier. Okay, I'm part of this process where the human species is going through right now, and part of this great initiation. And that may not make it much easier on a day-to-day basis, but at least I don't have to freak out about it. And also, we talked about agency earlier. One of the traps in the Plutonian insistence that only the individual has agency, that everything else is either random chance or it's doing what I tell it to, is you lose the ability to recognize that the universe is cosmos, that it is a beautiful order, that order is maintained by powers and potencies that are not human. They're greater than human. Call them gods, call them whatever you want. But we're not alone here. We're not, trapped in this vast echoing void and being fed into the grinder. Like somebody who goes through an initiation ritual, we may have been blindfolded, we may be being subjected to some fairly uncomfortable experiences. But there are initiates who are taking us through this ritual. They know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And a certain amount of trust in that process may be merited.
Yeah, that idea of the myth of separation, the myth of the loss of mystical union as a possibility is a part of the initiatory experience, because you have to be separated from it in some way. That's the test.
Yeah. It's the alchemists used to speak of sole et coagula. You divide and then you reunite. You take something apart and it's like fixing a clock. You take it apart, you clean and repair all the pieces, and then you put it back together again, and it works. So, yeah, that's that process. There has to be the separation before there can be the reintegration.
Yeah. No, it is mythic for a reason, because of how transcendently important it is. So, is there anything that you are hoping when you wrote this book, as one of the final questions, what are you hoping to see from more of like the wider professional astrological community with this? Because I am not a professional astrologer, but I have friends that are, and I'm curious what you think either what you think will unfold or what you hope might unfold with.
Well, I have no idea. First of all, I have no idea what will unfold. I have Asperger's syndrome, so I am lousy at guessing what people are going to do. I also don't have a lot of connection with the astrological community these days. I've mostly been involved in Druidry on the one hand and ceremonial magic and old-fashioned occultism on the other. And I read books by astrologers, but I know there's a whole world of people talking back and forth. I have no idea what people are going to do with it. I've presented a thesis. Probably some people will find it interesting. Some people will put it to use. Some people will reject it. I figure in 100 years, we'll know one way or the other how, what kind of impact it will have. Just as, so many of the trends that got set in motion by like Alan Leo back in the late 19th century took most of a century to finish working their way out into astrology and so on. So it's just, I don't know that I have a specific expectation. I saw something. I said, wow, this is interesting. I write books, so I wrote a book about it. Now it is in the hands of the astrological community and, of course, a lot of other people as well, and we'll see what they do with it.
Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and it has changed a number of different conceptions that I had about some of these things, and I am very excited to talk more about it with other people as these ideas unfold. But I want to thank you, and I wanted to ask if you could just tell us: are there any other things that you want to let people know that you're working on, or any other books that are coming out? I know with the number of books that you write, I want to make sure that you keep track.
There are always books coming out. Let's see. I just recently, also right about the same time that this one came out, I also had a book called The Druid Path, which is an introduction to Druidry for the complete beginner. I had a book entitled The Way of the Golden Section, which is the first of a series of books of old-fashioned occult training. This is not so much magic as meditation and divination philosophy, the various other aspects of occultism that tend to be neglected. In the sort of magic-centric thing. I'm currently working on more fiction. I wound up my series of tentacle novels a little while ago, but now I'm looking at some other fiction projects. And beyond that, we'll see. I'm having fun.
I'm sure that we will have you back on. I know that there's the Geometry Oracle, which I really want to have back on to talk about another month. So we will figure that out.
I will look forward to it.
Yes, and that is wonderful. And for where people should find you online, I will put everything in the show notes, but just for people who are listening, what is your website? Online,
you want to look for my blog is at www.ecosophia.net, ECOSOPHIA.net. My Dreamwidth journal, which, because I blog once a week, but the Dreamwidth journal is stuff popping up all the time. That is Ecosophia also, .dreamwidth.org. Also on bookshop.org. If you look up my name, John Michael Greer, or just JMG, you will find my bookshop, and that has nearly all my books.
That is great. And I will put links to all of that in the show notes below.
Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. And I'm always happy to have you on, and I can't wait for our next discussion. So thank you.
I will look forward to it as well.
Stars overhead, don't you dare go.